My son, Adrian, a surgeon whose hands I once taught to hold a pencil, and his wife, Melissa, a corporate lawyer whose tuition I once helped pay, sat across from me with a folder on the table. Inside was not just paper, it was a verdict. Sign over my $4.2 million home, the one I built with my late wife, Evelyn, or they would have me declared mentally incompetent. To them, I was not a father, not the man who sacrificed everything to give them the life they had. I was just an obstacle, a liability, a burden to be managed. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't my first audit. They saw an aging man with trembling hands, but what they failed to see was the auditor returning for one final review. And before I tell you what was in the folder I prepared for them in return, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you listening to my story from? Please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, because I promise you, this tale is not just about betrayal. It's about patience, quiet strength, and a revenge so precise that even the sharpest lawyer could never anticipate it. The late October sunlight poured through the window, casting long golden shadows on the hardwood floors of the living room I had polished with my own hands. This house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was 35 years of sweat, sacrifice, and memory. Every rose in the garden had been planted by Evelyn. Every stone in the patio had been laid by me and my son, back when he still looked at me with admiration instead of contempt. The air smelled of pine from the woods behind the property, but the peace was interrupted by the crunch of expensive tires on my gravel driveway, a sound I had come to dread. I didn't need to glance outside to know whose car it was. Adrian always arrived in that obsidian black German sedan, the kind of vehicle that cost more than the first house Evelyn and I, Eves, bought together. The sound of its engine wasn't a hum of arrival, it was the roar of intrusion. I rose slowly, my knees stiff from years of work, and walked to the door. I didn't bother dusting the soil from my hands. If they wanted to treat me like a relic, I would greet them as I was. The car doors slammed shut with the authority of people who had already won. Melissa stepped out first, in a slate-gray suit, her briefcase tucked under her arm like a weapon. Adrian followed, his shirt pressed, his shoes shining. There was no warmth in his face, no trace of the boy who once tugged at my sleeve, begging me to throw a baseball with him in the yard. They approached me not as family, but as predators, cloaked in politeness, ready to strip me of everything. The October air was cool against my skin as I stood on the porch, watching them walk up the stone path Evelyn and I had laid by hand decades ago. To me, every stone was a memory. To them, it was just property value. Adrian walked with a surgeon's precision, his chin lifted ever so slightly, as though the world itself was beneath him. Melissa's heels sank into the earth as she crossed the lawn, and even that small detail irritated her. I could see it in the twitch of her mouth. She wasn't here to admire the home or the roses. She was calculating square footage, market value, and the size of her prize. They didn't even greet me like family. "Dad," Adrian said, not warmly, not with love, but with the clipped tone of a man delivering bad news to a patient. He didn't ask how I was doing, didn't look at the roses, didn't even step forward to embrace me. He only scanned me as if he were assessing whether I was weak enough to push. Melissa followed his lead. She adjusted her suit jacket, straightened her spine, and used my first name, a tactic she always favored. "Arthur," she said, her voice cool and rehearsed, "we need to have a serious conversation about the logistics of your living situation." Arthur, not Dad, not Father, not even Mr. Graham. Just Arthur, as though stripping me of the title that meant the most would somehow weaken me before the battle even began. She opened her briefcase and placed a thick folder on the glass patio table. The click of the latch was sharp, final, like the sound of a cell door closing. "We've been reviewing the numbers," she said smoothly, her tone that of a lawyer standing in front of a jury. "This house, this estate, it's too much for one person to maintain. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2 acres of land, heating costs, taxes, repairs. It isn't fiscally responsible." Fiscally responsible. That was the phrase she used, as if Evelyn's roses could be reduced to a line item, as if 35 years of my life with her could be erased with a balance sheet. Adrian chimed in, placing a hand on my shoulder as though he were the doctor and I the patient. "We're just worried about you, Dad. Living alone at your age comes with risks. We've noticed, Well, certain lapses, forgetfulness, slower responses. It's about your safety. His tone was clinical, detached, like he was dictating notes for a chart. The words hung in the autumn air like a knife. They weren't here to help me. They weren't here to love me. They were here to take from me. I looked into Adrian's eyes as he spoke, but I no longer saw my son. I saw a man in an expensive shirt, polished shoes, and a mask of concern stretched tight across his face. Beneath it was not love, not worry, but hunger. Hunger for what he thought was already his. Melissa stood just behind him, her arms folded, her briefcase still resting on the patio table like a loaded weapon. She didn't even pretend to soften her words. "Arthur," she said, her tone crisp and deliberate. "Massachusetts law is very clear. When someone of advanced age demonstrates diminished capacity, their family has a fiduciary duty to intervene. This isn't just about your comfort. It's about responsibility." Responsibility. The word was like acid in my ears. I had carried responsibility my entire life. I was the one who worked 70-hour weeks as an accountant, who saved every dollar, who taught Adrian to balance a checkbook before he even learned to drive. I had shouldered responsibility when Melissa was in law school and couldn't pay rent, when Adrian needed loans for medical school, when Evelyn got sick and hospital bills piled up. I had carried all of it without complaint, and now they had the audacity to wield that word against me. Adrian squeezed my shoulder with a proprietary touch, like a doctor claiming his patient. "Dad, this isn't just about money, it's about risk. You could fall. You could forget to turn off the stove. Melissa and I, we just want to take care of you. That's all." His voice was gentle, but it was the kind of gentleness that masked a blade. I stood silent for a moment, staring past them to the roses Evelyn planted, their deep red blooms glowing in the waning light. She used to say roses were like families. You had to prune them, protect them, tend to them carefully. If you neglected them, the thorns would take over, and the beauty would be lost. My son and his wife weren't pruning the roses. They were uprooting the whole garden. Melissa opened the folder and slid a set of papers across the table toward me. The white pages glared in the sun, full of legal language meant to strip me of everything. "This is a quitclaim deed," she said matter-of-factly. "Your signature here transfers joint ownership of this property to Adrian and me. It ensures continuity. It prevents complications later." She tapped the signature line with one manicured finger. I looked at her hand, steady and confident, then at Adrian's face, so sure of himself. They thought they had cornered me. They thought the old man would crumble. But what they didn't know was that they weren't the only ones holding cards at this table. The silence between us thickened until it felt like a wall pressing against my chest. The papers lay on the table like a trap already sprung, their edges sharp with betrayal. I could hear the faint buzzing of bees around Evelyn's roses, the distant hum of a lawnmower down the street. But here in my yard, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Adrian shifted in his chair, leaning forward, his surgeon's hands clasped together as though preparing to deliver a diagnosis. His eyes locked on Mintz, cold and calculating, and then he said it. "We're moving in tomorrow, Dad." The words dropped like stones into the stillness. Not a suggestion, not even a request. It was a declaration, a verdict. "We've already arranged everything," he continued. "Melissa and I will take the master suite upstairs, and you can have the guest room by the den. Melissa will handle the finances, and I'll be able to keep an eye on your health. It's for the best. For everyone." For everyone. That's how he framed it. As though robbing me of my dignity, stripping me of the life Evelyn and I had built, was a favor. Melissa didn't even flinch. She sat there, her briefcase open like a vulture's wings, her face calm, her eyes hard. She wasn't moving in as a daughter-in-law. She was invading as a conqueror. I stared at my son, at the man who once knelt beside me in this very garden, his tiny hands digging clumsily in the dirt as he giggled at the worms wriggling through the soil. I remembered how proud he was when he managed to plant his first flower. That boy, with mud on his cheeks and sunlight in his eyes, no longer existed. He had been replaced by this stranger in a polished polo shirt, a man whose smile was a scalpel, whose words cut deeper than any blade. "Your mother would have wanted you cared for," Adrian pressed, his voice dripping with false concern. "She wouldn't want you clinging to the past like this." And there it was, the weapon I never thought he would use. Evelyn's memory, twisted into leverage. He wielded her love like a crowbar to pry open the lock of my will. A cold fury rose in me, sharper than grief, stronger than age. For years I had forgiven their distance, excused their absence as busyness, mistaken their selfishness for ambition. But this This was no misunderstanding. This was betrayal, deliberate and cruel. I let the silence stretch, my face calm, my voice steady. No one, I said slowly, each word deliberate, is moving into this house. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. Adrian's mask of concern flickered, revealing a flash of raw frustration. But it was Melissa who truly showed her hand. Her faint smile vanished as she straightened her posture, sliding the briefcase fully onto the patio table. The metallic click of its latches breaking open was sharp enough to cut the air. She moved with the cold precision of a litigator who knew her case was airtight. In that moment, she was no longer my daughter-in-law. She was opposing counsel, and my garden was her courtroom. "I was hoping we could handle this amicably, Arthur," she began, her voice low, even, and sharpened to a point. "But clearly you're not willing to be reasonable. That's unfortunate, because we are prepared for this outcome." She pulled out a sleek, leather-bound folder and laid it carefully in front of me, sliding it across the glass with deliberate ease. Inside were neatly arranged documents, their edges aligned perfectly, their weight meant to intimidate. "You may not be aware of Massachusetts state law regarding conservatorship," she continued, her tone dripping with condescension, "when an individual demonstrates diminished capus city and fails to responsibly manage significant assets, the family is legally obligated to petition the probate court. It is our fiduciary duty. If you refuse to cooperate, that process will begin immediately." Her words struck like hammer blows. Conservatorship. A public stripping of dignity. A courtroom battle where my finances, my medical records, my very sanity would be paraded before strangers. Melissa's eyes gleamed with quiet triumph as she pressed on. "Adrian has colleagues, respected physicians, who would be more than willing to testify to your cognitive decline. The court would have no difficulty granting guardianship. Of course, that would be messy. Your privacy would be gone. Your independence, gone. But we don't want that. You don't want that." She tapped her manicured nail against the first page, a quitclaim deed. "Sign here, and everything stays private. You add Adrian and me to the title of this house, and we avoid the courtroom entirely. It's a clean solution that protects everyone." I looked at the folder, then at my son, who now stood with his arms crossed, projecting the stern authority of a physician delivering a grim prognosis. They had planned this perfectly. The medical threat from him, the legal threat from her, a pincer movement designed to crush me from both sides. They believed they had accounted for every variable, every possible objection. But what they didn't realize was that the man they saw before them was not a frail old widower. I was the same auditor who had spent 40 years dissecting corporate ledgers, exposing hidden weaknesses, and uncovering frauds that billion-dollar companies thought invisible. They thought I was cornered. In reality, they had just revealed their entire strategy. For a long moment, I let the weight of their words linger. The papers lay in front of me like chains, the ink already heavy with the assumption of my defeat. Adrian's jaw was tight, his eyes sharp, Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line of certainty. They thought the old man was cornered, that fear or pride would drive me into an outburst they could use against me, but they had forgotten who I was. I leaned back in my chair, the autumn breeze brushing against my face, and then I did something that made both of them falter. I smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, but with the quiet confidence of a man who has seen this kind of game played before and knows how it ends. The smile of an auditor who has just spotted the hidden flaw in the numbers. "All right," I said evenly, my voice calm, steady, almost casual. "If you believe this is what's best, then let's discuss it properly. Not here, not in my garden, but at my lawyer's office. Friday at 10 in the morning. David Whitaker. You know the name?" Their faces shifted. Adrian blinked, momentarily thrown off script. Melissa's eyes narrowed, her mind calculating, reassessing. This wasn't the trembling refusal they had expected. It wasn't desperate anger. It was composure, strategy, control. "Dad," Adrian said carefully, as though coaxing a patient back onto the operating table, "we don't need to involve anyone else. This can be handled within the family." I let my smile linger just long enough to unsettle him. "Families protect one another," I said softly, "and lawyers make cigars. Poor families remember their promises. Friday, 10. Melissa closed the folder slowly, her jaw tightening. She didn't like it. Her instincts told her delays were dangerous. She preferred swift, clean victories where her opponent never had time to gather strength. But Adrian, blinded by his own arrogance, mistook my calm for surrender. He placed a reassuring hand on her arm, nodding. "Fine," she said finally, snapping the briefcase shut with a click that echoed like a gavel. "Friday, then. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Arthur." They turned and walked back to their car, their stride confident but tinged now with a sliver of unease. The silver sedan roared back down the driveway, leaving behind only the faint smell of exhaust and arrogance. I stood alone in the garden, the roses still blooming around me, their red petals a reminder of Evelyn's love. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was folding, but the truth was far colder, far sharper. They had no idea the audit had already begun. The house was still after they left, but not silent. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second landing with the weight of a countdown. The echo of their arrogance still hung in the air, clinging to the walls like smoke. I walked slowly through the living room, my hand brushing against the wooden banister Evelyn used to polish until it gleamed. For a moment, the grief almost buckled me. She should have been here to see what her son had become, but grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. What I needed now was clarity. What I needed was precision. I stepped into my study, closing the heavy oak door behind me. The room smelled of leather, old books, and faintly of Evelyn's perfume that still lingered on the throw blanket draped over my chair. This was my sanctuary, the one space in the house untouched by anyone else. The dark wood shelves held decades of financial records, boxes of tax returns, binders of careful investments, and ledgers I had kept with the discipline of a man who understood that every penny had a purpose. I lowered myself into the worn leather chair at my desk, the same chair where I had once taught Adrian to balance his first budget, where I had stayed up nights figuring out how to afford his private school tuition. My hands rested on the polished wood, steady now, my breath even, and then, without hesitation, I picked up the phone. The number I dialed was one I had never forgotten, though it had been years since I last called it. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. David Whitaker. Hearing his name, I felt a small measure of relief. David wasn't just my lawyer. He was my friend of more than 40 years. We had stood side by side through boardroom negotiations, estate planning, and Evelyn's will. He knew me, and more importantly, he knew how I operated. David, I said evenly, it's Arthur. There was a brief pause, then his voice warmed. Arthur, my old friend, how are you? How's Evelyn's garden holding up? The garden is fine, I replied, but the sun is not. The warmth vanished from his tone. Tell me. So I did. I told him about Adrian's Vesau. Sit. About Melissa's threats. About the quitclaim deed and the ultimatum of conservatorship. I spoke like I was delivering an audit report. Cold, factual, every detail precise. When I finished, there was only silence on the line. Then came David's voice, sharp and fierce. They want to strip you of everything? No. Not without a fight. I closed my eyes, the faintest smile tugging at my lips. David, I don't want anger. I want everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that comes when a man knows the ground beneath him is shifting. David's tone dropped lower, sharper, no longer that of a friend catching up, but of a lawyer sensing a storm. Everything? He repeated slowly. Define everything, Arthur. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes travel over the rows of binders on the shelves, each one a chapter in the financial history of my family. Start with the education files, I said. Pull the records for St. Mark's Academy, 4 years of private tuition, then Stanford, every semester, every check I wrote. Don't forget Johns Hopkins for medical school. I want a full tally. I heard David scribbling on the other end of the line, his pen racing to keep up. Arthur, that's decades worth of payments. You gave that boy everything. No, I corrected him softly. I loaned him everything. There was a long pause. I could almost hear him frowning. What are you saying? You remember 2004, I said, my voice steady. The year Adrian got into Johns Hopkins. Tuition was staggering, more than $350,000 for the full program. Evelyn wanted me to gift it to him outright, but you and I stopped, letting the weight of memory hang between us. You and I drew up the papers. An intra-family loan, official, notarized, enforceable, 4% annual interest, compounding. I could hear David's breath catch. The sound of realization hit him before his words did. My God, he muttered. You're right. I notarized it myself. We filed it away as a formality, and then you never mentioned it again. I let him believe it was a gift, I admitted. I let him carry the illusion, because I thought his success would be repayment enough. $500,000 a year in salary, then more. I thought his happiness was my return on investment. I shook my head, my hand curling into a fist on the armrest. But he never paid a cent, not one. He forgot. Or maybe he chose to forget. David's voice hardened, a blade sliding from its sheath. And now you're calling in the debt. Not just the debt, I said quietly. I want the full calculation. Principal and interest, every cent, and I want you to build me a complete history. Every car, every down payment, every gift I ever gave him, from his first bicycle to the money for that surgical practice. All of it. I want the total. The silence on the line was no longer hesitation. It was the silence of a man aligning himself with war. Consider it done, David said at last. By the time you sit across from them on Friday, you'll have numbers that will crush them. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. For the first time that day, I felt calm. They thought they had written the script, but they had forgotten. No one audits an auditor. That night, I sat alone in the study, the faint hum of my old desktop computer filling the silence like a companion. The glow from the oversized monitor lit up the dark-paneled room, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. On my desk sat a yellow legal pad, already filling with figures, arrows, and notes in my own careful handwriting. I hadn't felt this sharp in years. Grief had dulled me, age had slowed me, but now the numbers were alive again, and with them, so was I. David called just before midnight. His voice was steady, precise, the way it always became when the law was his weapon. "Arthur," he said, "I've run the numbers." I leaned forward, gripping the receiver tightly. "Tell me." "The principal was $350,000, he began, with compounding interest at 4% annually over 20 years. He paused for effect, but I didn't need drama. I needed numbers. "The total comes to just under $800,000, legally binding, ironclad. There isn't a court in this state that could ignore it. 800,000. The figure landed heavy in my chest, not as a burden, but as a weapon, clean and undeniable. My son thought he was about to inherit a mansion. Instead, he had inherited a debt that could crush him. But I wasn't finished. "And the rest?" I asked. "I've compiled everything," David replied, his voice darkening. "The tuition for St. Mark's Academy, the checks for Stanford, the down payment on his first condo, the car you bought him after graduation, even the seed money for that surgical practice. Every cent is documented. The total outlay, adjusted for inflation, is staggering. Adrian and Melissa may have thought you were a sentimental old man, but Arthur, you've kept records that could bury them." I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my bones. For decades, I had carried those sacrifices quietly, chalking them up to the duty of a father. Now, they were no longer just memories of generosity. They were evidence of a man who gave everything and was betrayed in return. "Good," I said softly. "Compile it into a binder, clean, organized, every figure supported. When we walk into that meeting on Friday, I want them to see the truth not as words, but as numbers that don't lie." David hesitated before speaking again. "Arthur, are you ready for this? Once you drop this on them, there's no going back." I stared at the wall where Evelyn's portrait once hung, the outline still faint on the wallpaper. "They came into my house and tried to turn me into a prisoner, David. I'm not just ready, I'm already halfway through the audit." The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet, but my mind was loud, humming with the rhythm of numbers and possibilities. I sat at the kitchen table with a black cup of coffee, staring out at the garden as the first light broke through the trees. Evelyn used to say mornings were her favorite, because no matter how dark the night had been, the sun always returned. I wondered what she would say now, seeing the son we had raised plotting against his own blood. By mid-morning, David called again. His voice was brisk, efficient, already a step ahead. "Arthur," he said, "I think it's time we added another layer to this. If we want to break them completely, we'll need more than numbers. We'll need their own words." "You mean surveillance?" I replied, my voice steady. "I mean evidence," David corrected. "Something undeniable, something they can't spin with charm or dismiss as exaggeration. I know a man, Peterson, ex-detective, quiet, invisible, and thorough. If Adrian and Melissa have been celebrating their little scheme, he'll catch it. There was no hesitation in me. Hire him. By evening, Peterson was in motion, a man you wouldn't notice even if he sat beside you at the bar. While I walked my garden path under the October stars, he was sliding into the polished interior of a high-end steakhouse in Hartford, where Adrian and Melissa had chosen to dine. To the other patrons, he looked like a tired businessman nursing a glass of club soda, but in reality, his phone was angled just right, its microphone tuned to the corner booth where my son and his wife raised their glasses. That night, Peterson sent me the first file. I sat in the study, headphones in, the glow of my computer bathing the room in cold light. The recording began with the clink of crystal in Melissa's voice, sharp and confident. "To a smooth transition," she said, her tone dripping with victory. Adrian laughed, smug and unguarded. "To finally getting what we deserve." I closed my eyes, the fury in me solidifying into something colder, stronger. They thought they were celebrating a triumph. They had no idea their every word was now an exhibit in my case, a confession carved into stone. They believed they were predators circling an old, weak man. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly see, was that the trap they thought they were tightening around me had already begun to close around them. The audio crackled softly in my ears as I leaned back in the leather chair, letting every word sink into me like a blade. After their toast, the recording carried on, the clinking of glasses fading into the low murmur of their voices. Peterson had captured everything. Melissa's tone was cold, matter-of-fact, the way she probably sounded in a courtroom when dismantling a witness. "The moment Arthur signs that deed, the house is ours to manage," she said. "I've already spoken with a contact at the bank. With a $4.2 million property as collateral, debt-free, we'll have access to a credit line large enough to wipe everything clean. The credit cards, the second mortgage on the condo, the malpractice insurance loan, all of it gone in a single stroke." There was a pause, and then Adrian's voice came through, tinged with relief. "Finally, no more juggling bills, no more late-night calls from collectors. We'll be free. Free." The word curdled in my stomach. Their freedom was to be bought with my chains. My house, my sanctuary, was nothing but a lifeboat to them, a way to save themselves from drowning in debts of their own making. Melissa's voice returned, steady and confident. "Once the paperwork is filed, we wait a year, 18 months at most. Just enough time to make it appear as though we're caring for him. We do some renovations, minor ones, nothing too costly, just enough to justify the transition. Then we sell. A clean profit. We'll walk away with millions." "And what about Dad?" Adrian asked after a beat of silence. His voice was softer now, uncertain, as though a faint ember of conscience still flickered inside him. Melissa snuffed it out with one sentence. "I've already researched assisted living facilities. There's one in Mystic with landscaped gardens and around-the-clock care. He'll be comfortable, but more importantly," she paused for effect, her voice turning to ice, "he'll be supervised." Supervised. The word hissed in my ear like venom. They weren't just planning to take my home, they were planning to erase me, to store me away like an old piece of furniture once my usefulness had expired. Peterson's notes came through at the end of the file. He'd observed them order a $90 bottle of champagne. They laughed, they kissed, they spoke about the future as if it were theirs to sculpt out of my ruin. When the file ended, I pulled the headphones off slowly and placed them on the desk. The room was dark except for the computer screen's glow, but inside me, something brighter than rage burned. Their words had confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't greed alone. It was desperation. They were drowning, and they were ready to let me sink to save themselves. But they had miscalculated. They thought I was the weakest man at the table. They didn't realize that patience was my strength, and numbers, cold, undeniable numbers, were my weapons. I sat in the silence of my study long after the recording ended, the faint echo of their laughter still vibrating in my chest like a bruise. For years I had told myself their distance was simply the cost of ambition, that Adrian's missed calls, Melissa's clipped visits, their transactional conversations were symptoms of busy lives, not of neglect. I excused them because Evelyn would have wanted me to. She always believed in forgiveness, in patience, in giving people time to come back around. But as I replayed Melissa's words in my mind, "He'll be supervised," the truth landed with the weight of a hammer. This wasn't neglect, this was erasure. Grief had lived with me since the day Evelyn passed. It was familiar, almost comforting in its way, like a heavy coat I never took off. But now that grief burned away, leaving behind something cold, crystalline, and sharp, the warmth of sorrow was gone. What remained was clarity. I rose from my chair and walked to the mantel, where Evelyn's photograph still stood. She was smiling, her hair catching the sunlight, her head tilted back in laughter. I traced the frame with my fingers. "They used you," I whispered. "They used your memory as a weapon against me, but I won't let them take what we built. Not our home, not our life's work, not our dignity." As I stood there, I realized I was no longer thinking like a father. I was thinking like an auditor again, as though the last 20 years had melted away, and I was back in the boardroom dissecting balance sheets. I wasn't preparing for an argument. I was preparing for a closing report, final and absolute. I went back to my desk and opened the bottom drawer, where I kept files that hadn't seen daylight in years. Receipts, loan documents, investment statements, all neatly organized, waiting for the day they might be needed. I pulled them out one by one, stacking them in careful order. Each paper was a brick in the wall I was about to build, a fortress of facts that no lawyer, not even Melissa, could tear down. They thought they had time. A week until Friday, a week until the meeting where they would press for my surrender. But what they didn't understand was that every tick of the clock was mine, not theirs. Every hour was another figure tallied, another piece of evidence aligned, another weapon sharpened. I was no longer a grieving husband or a vulnerable old man. I was the quiet storm at the center of their arrogance. And by the time Friday arrived, they would understand that the man they had tried to bury had returned, not with anger, but with precision. The days that followed were some of the quietest of my life, and yet beneath that silence, I was moving with a precision that neither Adrian nor Melissa could begin to comprehend. On the surface, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I watered Evelyn's roses in the morning, read the paper at the kitchen table, and took my evening walk through the garden as the sun went down. To any neighbor passing by, I looked like a man filling his days with the rituals of old age. But beneath that calm exterior, the machinery of my plan was turning with relentless efficiency. I ignored their calls. The first one came on Monday morning. Adrian's voice, casual, almost forced. "Hey, Dad, just checking in. Hope you're doing all right." It went to voicemail. That afternoon, Melissa tried, her tone clipped and direct. "Arthur, it's Melissa. We should go over some details before Friday. Call me back." That too went unanswered. By Tuesday evening, there were 3 more missed calls, each one more insistent than the last. By Wednesday, they were leaving voicemails thick with irritation disguised as concern. "He's being dramatic," Adrian muttered into one message, as if sulking was the only weapon he believed I had left. But Melissa, her instincts were sharper. She didn't trust silence. She had lived too long in a world where silence was strategy, not surrender. Her voice trembled at the edges of one of her later messages. "Arthur, we need to finalize things. Avoiding us won't help. We'll see you Friday." While their anxiety simmered, I was sitting across from a woman named Claire Donovan in a quiet office above a coffee shop downtown. Claire was a real estate agent David trusted implicitly, one who specialized in discreet, off-market sales of high-value properties. She didn't advertise on bus benches or flash her face on billboards. Her clients didn't want visibility. They wanted results. By Wednesday evening, the paperwork was underway. A quiet listing, a select group of buyers contacted, private viewings scheduled with precision. The market was hot, and my property, prime land, expansive gardens, a house with character, was irresistible to the right kind of buyer. Evelyn and I had built it to last, and now it would outlast even the betrayal of our son. Every time. The phone buzzed with another missed call. I let it ring, the sound no longer a nuisance but a signal. Every unanswered voicemail was another brick in the wall I was building around myself. They thought silence meant defeat, but in truth, silence was my greatest weapon. While they stewed in impatience and unease, I was dismantling their lifeboat piece by piece. By Thursday evening, everything was in motion. Claire had worked with the kind of precision that would have made Evelyn proud. Within 48 hours of her discreet calls, 3 serious buyers had stepped forward, each one eager to close quickly on a property like mine. By Friday morning, a contract was signed, $4.2 million. Cash, no contingencies, no delays. The ink dried faster than Adrian or Melissa could have imagined, and with that signature, the house they thought was already theirs no longer belonged to me, or to them. It was gone, cleanly and irrevocably. But I wasn't finished. Selling the house was only the first strike. I wanted them to see, to feel, what it meant to have everything they coveted slip through their fingers. That meant I had to leave behind not a home, but an echo. The movers came under cover of night. A fleet of trucks, guided by men who asked no questions and worked with quiet efficiency. I stood in the center of the living room, watching as 35 years of life were carefully packed, labeled, and carried out the door. The grandfather clock Evelyn's parents had given us, the Persian rugs, the oil paintings, the books that had lined the shelves in my study, all of it was wrapped and loaded with the discipline of a military operation. By dawn, the house was unrecognizable. The rooms that once carried the warmth of family now echoed with emptiness. The kitchen counters were bare, the bedrooms stripped. Even Evelyn's roses, dug from the soil by gloved hands, were carefully transplanted into pots to be moved with me. Only faint outlines remained on the walls where portraits had hung, pale rectangles marking the absence of memory. I walked slowly through each room one last time, my footsteps loud against the bare floors. The house no longer breathed with life, it exhaled vacancy. But in that emptiness, I felt not loss but control. This was no longer a sanctuary for betrayal. It was a stage, carefully set, for revelation. On the mantel above the fireplace, I placed a thick manila envelope. My handwriting was steady, deliberate, the names written with absolute clarity. Adrian and Melissa Carter. Inside was not only the signed sale contract, but everything they needed to see, the loan documents, the calculations, the evidence of their debts, and eventually their own words transcribed from Peterson's recording. It was the final ledger, the closing statement of a lifetime's audit. When I stepped outside, the dawn air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I locked the door for the last time and handed the keys to Claire. The house behind me was no longer mine, but it was no longer theirs either. It was nothing more than an emptiness, a stage, waiting for the curtain to rise on their downfall. Friday morning came dressed in gray skies and a biting chill that seeped into my bones. I dressed carefully, not in a suit that might suggest confidence, but in a pair of well-worn slacks and a faded cashmere sweater Evelyn had always liked. I wanted to look small, tired, ready to surrender. Let them believe the fight had been bled out of me. Sometimes the best weapon is the mask your enemy gives you. David picked me up at 9 sharp. His office sat on the second floor of an old brick building downtown, its creaking floors and shelves of leather-bound law books, a quiet fortress against the slick modernity of the world Adrian and Melissa thought they ruled. The smell of strong coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint musk of old paper. This was a place of endurance, not flash, a perfect stage for what was to come. They arrived 5 minutes early, as I knew they would. Adrian, in a dark tailored suit, his surgeon's hands folded like a man about to deliver a life-altering prognosis. Melissa wore a razor-cut charcoal suit, her hair pulled tight in a bun, her leather briefcase gleaming like a weapon polished for war. They didn't walk in as family. They walked in like a hostile takeover team. We sat around the heavy mahogany table. David had scattered some files in front of him, deliberately messy, like the desk of a man unprepared, overwhelmed. Melissa seized the opening immediately, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Thank you for being reasonable, Arthur," she said smoothly. "We've prepared all the documents. Quit-claim deed, durable power of attorney for finances, standard procedure. This will ensure everything is managed properly moving forward." Adrian leaned in, his voice warm but false, carefully rehearsed. "Dad, this isn't about the house. It's about your safety. We just want peace of mind knowing you're cared for." I let my shoulders sag, my eyes dropped to the table. I forced my breath to hitch slightly, as though the weight of it all was crushing me. For a long moment I said nothing. Then, in a voice low and trembling, I whispered, "You're right, I'm tired. This house, it's too much for one person. The memories." My throat caught on the word. Relief spread across their faces like sunlight breaking through clouds. Adrian's shoulders eased. Melissa allowed herself the faintest smile. They believed the victory was theirs. I reached slowly for the pen lying on the table, my hand shaking just enough to sell the performance. Then, just as my fingers brushed the barrel, I stopped. I looked up, my eyes moist, my voice unsteady. "But not today. I need a week. Just a week to sort through your mother's things. To say goodbye properly." For a moment the room froze. Melissa's eyes narrowed, a flicker of calculation darting behind them like a shadow. She knew delay was dangerous. She had spent her career seizing opportunities in an instant, crushing opposition before it could breathe. To her, a week was not a mercy, it was a risk. But Adrian saw it differently. He leaned back in his chair, smug relief softening his face. To him, my trembling voice was the final proof he needed that I was beaten, broken, and ready to fold. He reached across the table and laid his hand on Melissa's wrist, steadying her before she could object. "Of course, Dad," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Take your week. We understand this isn't easy. We'll be back next Friday, and we'll finalize everything then." Melissa's jaw tightened, but she forced a brittle smile, her lawyer's instinct buried beneath her husband's ego. "Yes," she said evenly, "next Friday." I nodded, my face heavy with the expression of a man too tired to fight. But inside, a different smile formed, one they would never see. They believed they had cornered me, that my plea for time was nothing more than sentiment. What they didn't understand was that I had just won the only concession I needed. A week. And in that week I would dismantle every piece of their scheme. When they left the office, striding out with the confidence of conquerors, David waited until the door shut behind them before speaking. He gathered the messy pile of papers into a neat, deliberate stack, and looked at me with a grin that carried both admiration and disbelief. "Did they take the bait?" he asked. I picked up the heavy gold pen they had left on the table, feeling its weight in my hand. "Hook, line, and sinker," I replied. That evening, as their sedan disappeared into the city traffic, I was not at home sulking, as they surely imagined. Instead, I was overseeing the final steps of a plan that had been unfolding like clockwork. The movers had already cleared the last of my possessions. Claire had confirmed the closing. The house was not just sold, it was emptied, sterilized, prepared. By the time Adrian and Melissa returned, the sanctuary they thought they were inheriting would be nothing but a hollow shell. For the next 7 days, I lived in silence. To them, it looked like defeat. To me, it was strategy. Every unanswered call, every unreturned message was another crack forming in their confidence. By Wednesday, their arrogance would curdle into unease. By Thursday, unease into suspicion. And by Friday, when they pulled into the driveway, they would step not into victory, but into ruin. Friday morning arrived with the crisp bite of late October air. The maple trees lining the street had shed half their leaves, their branches bare and skeletal against the pale sky. It should have been a beautiful day for Adrian and Melissa, Victory Day, the moment they claimed what they thought was rightfully theirs. They drove in silence, the hum of the sedan filling the car, Adrian's fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel, while Melissa scrolled through her phone, already drafting renovation plans. In their minds, the house was theirs. But as they turned onto my street, their confidence met its first fracture. Adrian's foot slammed on the brake, jerking the car to a halt. His mouth fell slightly open, the color draining from his face. Melissa looked up, irritation flashing across her features until she followed his gaze, and froze. There, standing bold and immovable in the center of the front lawn, was a sign. Not the flimsy aluminum kind slapped up by desperate sellers, but a dark wood plaque. Card from a prestigious real estate firm. Its polished surface gleamed in the pale sunlight, and across it, in bold crimson letters, was a single word: sold. For a heartbeat, they sat in stunned silence, as though the air had been sucked from the car. "What the hell is that?" Adrian whispered, his voice brittle. Melissa's lawyer mind scrambled for control. "It's a mistake," she said quickly, though her tone lacked conviction. "Or it's a bluff. He's trying to scare us. Don't let it rattle you." But her eyes betrayed her, flicking nervously from the sign to the front door, as though the house itself were mocking her. They stepped out of the car, their movements stiffer now, their certainty beginning to fracture. The roses Evelyn had planted were still in bloom, their red petals defiant against the autumn chill, but the proud sign towering above them cast a shadow darker than any flower could resist. Melissa adjusted her suit jacket with jerky precision, trying to reclaim her composure. "Let's stick to the plan," she hissed. "We go inside, we get the signature. That sign doesn't change anything." But Adrian's hand trembled as he slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a hollow echo, and what greeted them was not the home they remembered. The familiar warmth, the curated comfort of decades. It was gone. The Persian rugs, the grandfather clock, the scent of lemon polish, all replaced by a cavernous emptiness that seemed to swallow their footsteps. Melissa's heels clicked on the marble floor, sharp and accusing. She glanced around the stripped foyer, her breath catching as though she were standing inside a tomb. The house wasn't waiting for them. It was haunting them. The echo of their footsteps carried through the empty rooms like a cruel joke. Every corner they turned revealed only more absence, the polished floors stripped bare, the walls naked where portraits once hung, faint rectangles of dustless wallpaper, the only ghosts of what had been there. The house, which they had imagined filling with new furniture and renovations, now stood hollow, soulless, unrecognizable. Melissa's breathing quickened as she moved from room to room, her heels clacking against the floor in sharp bursts. "No," she muttered under her breath, her voice tight. "This doesn't make sense. He couldn't." Adrian followed close behind, his eyes darting, his jaw clenching harder with every step. He had pictured walking into his father's house with triumph, with ownership. Instead, he felt like an intruder trespassing in a place already abandoned. And then they saw it. On the mantel above the cold fireplace sat a single object, perfectly placed, commanding the vast emptiness around it. A thick manila envelope. Their names written across the front in Arthur's steady, deliberate handwriting. Adrian and Melissa Carter. Melissa froze, her entire body stiffening as though she had stumbled across a live explosive. Adrian stepped forward, his hand hovering just above it, trembling. Slightly. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was so heavy that even the creak of the old house seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Melissa snatched it up, her fingers clumsy against the seal. She tore it open with the urgency of someone hoping to find reassurance inside, though deep down she already knew it contained the opposite. The first document slid out, its paper thick, its language cold and official. Adrian leaned over her shoulder as her lawyer's eyes scanned the page with ruthless speed, her face drained of color. "It's a sale contract," she whispered. Adrian's mouth went dry. "What?" She thrust the paper toward him, her voice rising. "The house. He sold it. 4.2 million, all cash, closed yesterday." Adrian stared at the bold black text, his eyes falling on his father's signature at the bottom, steady and unwavering. His throat closed around a sound that was half disbelief, half despair. Melissa's hands shook as she shuffled through the rest of the envelope, pulling out another document. Her sharp intake of breath told Adrian, before his eyes did, this was worse, much worse. It was the old loan agreement, carefully notarized, with compound interest calculated down to the cent. Adrian's name scrawled across the bottom in the careless signature of his youth, now transformed into a noose tightening around his present. The envelope wasn't just paper, it was judgment, and it had only just begun. Melissa's fingers, usually so precise, so steady, fumbled through the envelope again. Another stack of papers slid free, lighter this time, not heavy with legal jargon, but with something far more dangerous, a transcript, black ink on white pages, neatly typed, line by damning line. Adrian leaned over her shoulder, his pulse hammering in his ears. The first words he read made his stomach drop. "Adrian, the old man almost had me with that performance today, all that nonsense about Mom and painting the nursery." He felt his throat constrict, his own voice, his own words, staring back at him in perfect clarity. Melissa's lips parted, her eyes darting across the page. Melissa. His emotionalism was a predictable variable, an easy one to manipulate. Her face, so often a mask of control, cracked. Her hands trembled violently as she flipped to the next page. Line after line exposed them, every smug laugh, every cruel plan whispered over champagne. Adrian's, "to finally getting what we deserve." Melissa's cold explanation about consolidating assets, drawing credit, waiting 18 months to sell the house. Every damning phrase preserved with surgical precision. Adrian staggered back a step, his knees nearly buckling. This can't be real. How could he? Melissa cut him off with a sharp shake of her head, but the color had drained from her cheeks. "It's real," she whispered hoarsely. "He had us followed. He recorded us." The truth hit them like a wrecking ball. Their arrogance, their carelessness, had become their undoing. In their eagerness to celebrate, they had confessed everything, gift-wrapped their betrayal in their own voices, and handed it straight to the man they thought powerless. The transcript fell from Melissa's hands, pages scattering across the bare floor. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, to deny, but nothing came out. The lawyer, who always had an answer, had finally been rendered speechless. Adrian pressed a hand against the wall, his body trembling as though the house itself was shaking beneath him. He looked down at the papers littering the floor, contracts, loan agreements, transcripts, all forming a mosaic of their greed, their desperation, their betrayal. And then Melissa pulled out the last piece, a single note, handwritten in Arthur's familiar script. It was short, devastatingly so. "Adrian and Melissa, you wanted the house. I sold it. You wanted to manage my assets. I have protected them. This is not anger. This is a final audit. Good luck with your debts. Arthur. The word struck harder than any shout, colder than any courtroom defeat. It wasn't rage, it wasn't drama, it was a closing statement. The ledger balanced, the case closed. The papers lay scattered across the marble floor like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. Adrian dropped to his knees, fumbling through them with desperate hands, as though shuffling the pages could somehow change their meaning. His eyes caught on the loan document again. The bold figures, the relentless calculations of interest, the final total that stared at him like a death sentence. $792,000, he whispered, his voice hollow. The number seemed to echo in the empty house. We owe him almost $800,000. Melissa pressed her palms to her temples, her breathing ragged. No, this isn't possible. He told you it was a gift. He told you he paid for med school outright. Adrian shook his head violently, clutching the paper as if he could strangle it. I signed it, Melissa. Look. He jabbed at his own signature at the bottom, the careless scrawl of a young man too arrogant to care about fine print. It's my name. It's legal. It's binding. It's over. Melissa staggered back a step, her lawyer's training screaming inside her head, searching for loopholes, weaknesses, anything to claw back control. But the documents were meticulous. Arthur had kept every receipt, every contract, every notarized form. There were no gaps to exploit, no cracks to wedge open. The very tools she used to build cases in court had been turned against her with surgical precision. Her voice broke into a bitter laugh, jagged and humorless. We didn't just lose the house. We inherited a debt the size of a second mortgage. We're ruined. Adrian slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the cold floor, surrounded by the wreckage of their schemes. His surgical hands, once so steady, now shook uncontrollably as he stared at the transcripts of their own damning words. The grand future he had boasted about, the Carter Surgical Institute, his name on the building, the empire he thought was within his grasp, crumbled before his eyes. Melissa looked at the note again, Arthur's steady handwriting burning into her vision. This is not anger. This is a final audit. She realized then that this wasn't revenge born from rage. This was judgment, deliberate and irrefutable. And she, the lawyer who prided herself on control, had no defense to... See, for years they had built their lives on the illusion of power, luxury cars, penthouses, fine wine, the arrogance of untouchable youth, but all of it had been propped up by debt, by lies, by the belief that Arthur was too weak to challenge them. Now, with a single envelope, he had shattered it all. The house was gone, their lifeboat was gone, and in its place stood a mountain of debt that neither of them could climb. The air here was different. It carried the salt of the Pacific and the warmth of a sun that seemed to rise brighter each morning. I stood on the balcony of my new home, a modest penthouse overlooking the endless blue stretch of San Diego's coastline. The view wasn't about luxury, it was about freedom. The horizon was unbroken, vast, infinite. No walls of debt, no schemes lurking in the corners, no whispers of betrayal clinging to the furniture. For the first time in years, I breathed without weight pressing on my chest. Inside, my laptop hummed softly on the table. On the screen, David's familiar face smiled back at me, framed by the creaking bookshelves of his old office. But this time, there were no frantic calls, no strategies whispered like battle plans. This time, it was about the future. The paperwork is finalized, Arthur, he said, holding up a document with quiet pride. The Evelyn Carter Scholarship Fund is officially endowed, $4 million, one of the largest single donations the university has ever received. I stared at the document for a long moment, my chest tightening not with grief, but with something warmer, something like pride. Evelyn's name would live on, not as leverage twisted by Melissa, not as a memory mocked in negotiations, but as a beacon. Her belief in education, her conviction that knowledge built character, as much as careers, would outlast both of us. She would have loved this, I said, my voice low but steady. She always said the world needed more doctors and lawyers with hearts, not just ones chasing money. David nodded, his smile softening. And now her name will make that happen. Every student who earns that scholarship will know who Evelyn was and what she stood for. When the call ended, I sat in the golden light of late afternoon, the ocean waves breaking against the shore below like a steady heartbeat. On the table beside my laptop sat a silver picture frame. Evelyn, caught mid-laughter, her head tilted back as the sun played in her hair. It was taken on this very coast years ago, during a vacation where we had dreamed of one day living by the ocean. She had looked out at the water then and said, "This is where life begins again." Now, at last, I understood. Life had begun again, not in anger, not in victory alone, but in dignity restored. The debts were settled. The audit was complete, and in its place was peace, wide as the ocean stretching before me. Even now, as I sit with the sun sinking into the Pacific, I think back on what happened not as a battle, but as an audit. Every life, in the end, must be balanced. Every choice leaves a mark. Every betrayal writes its own invoice, and sooner or later, the bill co. Mesdu. Adrian and Melissa thought they were clever, thought they could outmaneuver me with titles, degrees, and arrogance, but they had forgotten the simplest truth. Experience is its own kind of power. They had wealth, yes. They had youth, ambition, and the polish of success. But I had patience, I had discipline, and I had the numbers. Cold, undeniable numbers that don't care about lies or arrogance. They thought they were predators circling an old man. In reality, they had walked into the meticulous calculations of someone who had spent a lifetime turning chaos into order. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to shout or strike. I simply revealed the truth and let it do the work. The house they believed was theirs vanished from their grasp. The future they plotted collapsed under the weight of their own words, and the debts they tried to bury came roaring back to life with a figure so heavy it will haunt them for years. I did not destroy my son. I simply presented him with the bill for his own choices. He will live with them as he must. Perhaps one day he will understand what Evelyn and I tried to give him, and what he chose to squander. Or perhaps he will remain bitter, blaming me instead of facing the truth. Either way, the ledger is balanced. That is all that matters. The greatest legacy is not in the houses we pass down or the fortunes we accumulate. It is in the dignity we protect, the values we uphold, and the good we create with what we have. Evelyn's name now lives in the scholarship fund that will shape generations of young doctors and lawyers, not ones who hunger for power, but ones who carry compassion and responsibility. That, not the walls of a house or the figures in a bank account, is the inheritance worth leaving. So I sit here now, tea cooling beside me, Evelyn's photograph catching the last light of day, and I smile. Not the sharp smile of a man who has just won a war, but the calm smile of one who has finished his work. The audit is complete, the books are closed, and the life that remains is my own. If this story touched you, share it. With someone who believes, as I do, that true strength isn't found in greed or noise, but in patience, wisdom, and the quiet courage to protect what truly matters.